The chandeliers of Hartwick House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light refracting through crystal prisms to cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor, where couples whirled in time to the orchestra's waltz, and Eleanor Hartwell stood at the periphery of it all, her gloved hands clasped before her pale blue gown, watching as she had watched for 10 years now, her gaze fixed upon a single figure across the expanse of silk and satin and swirling bodies. Lord Adrian Blackwood stood near the far column, his dark evening clothes immaculate, his posture, that particular combination of ease and alertness that had first captured her attention when she was 18, and foolish enough to believe that noticing someone might mean they would notice you in return. He was speaking with Lord Wessex and his wife, his head inclined slightly in that way he had when listening, and Eleanor knew without being able to hear him that his voice would be low and measured, each word chosen with care, because she had observed him from distances like this for a decade and had learned the vocabulary of his gestures, the grammar of his movements, even as he had never learned hers. The ache that lived beneath her ribs, that old familiar companion, tightened as she watched him laugh at something Lady Wessex said, his rare smile transforming his usually severe features into something that made her heart perform its practiced leap and fall. She had become fluent in the language of loving someone who did not see her, in the particular pain of standing in the same room as the object of one's devotion and being as invisible as the servants who moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. 10 years of balls and assemblies and dinner parties where their paths crossed with the regularity of celestial bodies that never quite aligned, where he would enter a room and her awareness of him would sharpen every sense she possessed, and he would pass her with the same polite disinterest he showed the wallpaper. Eleanor had long since stopped hoping he would ask her to dance. Hope was a luxury she had surrendered somewhere around the 5th year, replaced by this duller thing, this resigned longing that had settled into her bones like winter cold into old houses. She watched as he excused himself from the Wessexes, watched as he moved through the crowd with that particular grace that seemed effortless, but which she suspected was as carefully maintained as everything else about him, and she knew with the certainty born of pattern that he would not glance her direction, would not acknowledge her presence, and would continue through this evening and all the evenings to come, treating her as he always had, as if she were not there at all. The music swelled, couples turned in their elegant rotations, and Eleanor felt the weight of accumulated invisibility press down upon her shoulders as she accepted what she had accepted 1,000 times before. That loving someone from afar was not noble or romantic, but simply a quiet, persistent heartbreak that one learned to carry like a stone in one's pocket, present and heavy and unchanged. 10 years earlier, Eleanor Hartwell had stood in this very ballroom, smaller than, it had seemed, or perhaps she had simply been larger in her innocence, filled with the kind of hope that makes 18-year-old girls believe the world is constructed specifically for their happiness, wearing a white gown that her mother had commissioned, specially for her debut, her hair arranged in careful curls that had taken her lady's maid 2 hours to achieve, and her heart beating with the peculiar mixture of terror and anticipation that accompanies all significant beginnings. The season had stretched before her like an unwritten book, each page blank with possibility, and she had moved through the receiving line with her parents, curtsying to Lady Hartwick and her daughters, and then suddenly he was there, introduced by their hostess as Lord Adrian Blackwood, second son of the Earl of Thornbury, recently returned from 2 years abroad, and Eleanor had looked up into his face and felt something shift fundamentally in her chest, as if a door she had not known existed had suddenly opened onto a landscape she had never imagined. He was 24 then, already established in society despite his status as a younger son, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he had recently run his hand through it, and eyes of such a deep grey they appeared nearly black in the candlelight, and when he bowed over her hand and murmured the conventional pleasantries expected of such an introduction, she had felt the warmth of his fingers through her glove and thought wildly, inexplicably, that she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you will enjoy your first season," he had said, his voice carrying that measured quality she would come to recognize, each syllable placed with precision, and she had managed to reply something appropriate, though later she could never recall what words she had used, only that her voice had sounded strange to her own ears, breathless and higher than usual. The introduction had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, a polite bow, those few words, and then he had moved on to greet the next person in line, and Eleanor had continued forward into the ballroom with her parents, but something had already taken root inside her, some seed of recognition or longing or fate that she could not name, but could feel growing with each breath she took. Throughout that first ball, she had been aware of him in the way one is aware of true north when holding a compass, some internal mechanism always oriented toward his position in the room, and she had watched covertly as he danced with several young ladies, as he conversed with various gentlemen, as he moved through the evening with an ease that suggested he belonged to this world in a way she did not yet. And she had thought that perhaps later he would ask her to dance, that their introduction had meant something, that the door she had felt opening would lead somewhere. But he had not approached her again that night, had not sought her out among the other debutantes, had passed her twice in the crush of the crowd without any sign of recognition, and when her father had finally suggested they take their leave, Eleanor had glanced back one final time to see Adrian Blackwood standing near the terrace doors, his profile illuminated by moonlight, beautiful and remote as a figure in a painting, and she had felt the first whisper of what would become her constant companion over the next decade, the ache of wanting someone who did not want her in return. The decade had accumulated like sediment, a layer upon layer of balls and soirees and garden parties, where Eleanor had watched Adrian Blackwood move through society with the careful grace of someone who had mastered the art of being present while remaining fundamentally apart, and she had become a scholar of his habits, an unwilling expert in the minutiae of his existence, gleaned from observation and overheard conversation and the particular torture of proximity without connection. She knew that he preferred Mozart to Handel, that he took his tea without sugar, that he had a habit of touching the signet ring on his left hand when engaged in serious conversation, that he danced precisely twice at most balls, once with whatever unmarried daughter of his hostess required the social courtesy, and once with a respectable widow or married woman to deflect the matchmaking ambitions of ambitious mothers, and that he never, in 10 years of shared social circles, asked Eleanor herself to dance. She had watched him converse with gentlemen about politics and horse breeding and estate management, had observed the way women fluttered their fans and angled their bodies toward him in transparent invitation, and had seen him navigate the treacherous waters of society with a skill that suggested he had charted every current and hidden reef, and through it all he had maintained his careful distance from her, as consistent and reliable as the North Star, and just as unreachable. Her friends had tried to help in the way friends do, with gentle suggestions wrapped in concern, and Catherine Thornbury had said over tea in the 3rd year that perhaps Eleanor might benefit from considering other gentlemen, that Lord Blackwood seemed quite determined in his bachelorhood, and Elizabeth Waverley had been more direct in the 7th year, declaring that Eleanor was wasting her youth on a man who clearly had no interest, and just last month her cousin Margaret had asked with exasperation why Eleanor persisted in attending events she knew he would frequent if she found his presence so distressing. But Eleanor could not explain what she barely understood herself, could not articulate why her heart insisted on its foolish loyalty, why the thought of deliberately avoiding him felt worse than the pain of seeing him ignore her, why some stubborn part of her soul refused to release this impossible attachment, even as her rational mind catalogued all the evidence of its futility. She had tried in the 4th year to accept the attentions of Mr. Whitmore, had allowed him to call and to escort her on walks and to sit beside her at dinners, but when he had spoken of his admiration for her, she had felt only a vast emptiness where reciprocal feeling should have resided. And when she had seen Adrian across the room at the Beaumont ball and felt that familiar constriction in her chest, she had realized with quiet despair that her heart recognized only one master, regardless of how cruelly he ignored its service. The years had taught her to hide her affliction better, to smile appropriately and dance with other partners and engage in conversation without her attention, obviously wandering to wherever Adrian stood in the room, but they had not taught her how to stop loving him, and as she stood now at 28, with another season drawing to a close and another year of invisibility recorded in the ledger of her disappointed heart, Eleanor wondered if perhaps her friends were right, if perhaps it was time to accept that some longings were never meant to be fulfilled, and that she would carry this useless love to her grave like a woman buried with a treasure no one wanted to claim. The conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, when the cherry blossoms had begun to fall from the trees in the garden, like snow made of petals, and Eleanor had been reading in the morning room when her mother entered with her father following behind, their expressions carrying that particular weight that announces significant pronouncements, and even before they sat across from her in the matching chairs, upholstered in cream silk, Eleanor felt something in her stomach tighten with foreknowledge of unwelcome news. Her father cleared his throat in the manner he always employed before discussing matters of consequence, and her mother folded her hands in her lap with a composure that did not quite reach her eyes, and they began with the usual preambles about her well-being and their concern for her future, their love for her and their desire to see her settled, and Eleanor set down her book and prepared herself for what she had known, in some deep place beneath her conscious thought, must eventually come. "Lord Pemberton has expressed his interest in paying you particular attention," her mother said, her voice carrying that bright quality women adopt when presenting difficult truths as pleasant opportunities, and her father added that Pemberton was a respectable man, financially sound, with estates in Yorkshire that provided a comfortable income and a London residence suitable for the season, and that at 28, Eleanor could no longer afford to dismiss such advantageous prospects without serious consideration. The words hung in the air between them like a sentence pronounced, and Eleanor understood with absolute clarity what was being communicated beneath the careful language that she had become a burden, that her persistent spinsterhood reflected poorly on the family, that her parents' patience with her inexplicable reluctance to marry had reached its natural terminus, and that this was not truly a discussion, but rather a declaration dressed in the clothing of parental consultation. She thought of the past 10 years, of the seasons that had accumulated like falling leaves, of the proposals she had gently declined from Mr. Whitmore and Captain Sheffield, and even young Lord Hartley, who had been sweet but utterly unsuitable, and she understood that her parents had been more than generous in allowing her to refuse these matches, had indulged what they surely perceived as female capriciousness, or perhaps an overly romantic disposition that needed time to mature into practical acceptance, but that their generosity had limits, and she had finally reached them. "Lord Pemberton is everything appropriate," her mother continued, leaning forward with an urgency that betrayed her studied calm, "and you are not growing younger, Eleanor, and we will not always be here to provide for you. And what will become of you then, without a husband, without protection, dependent upon your brother's charity, or forced to take employment as a governess or companion?" Her father's face softened with something like pity as he added that they only wanted her happiness, her security, that they could not bear to think of her alone and unprotected in a world that showed little mercy to unmarried women of advanced age. And Eleanor felt the walls of her life contracting around her like a room growing smaller with each breath. She wanted to argue, to explain that she had been waiting, hoping that there was a reason for her refusals, even if she could not articulate it without sounding like a foolish girl clinging to fantasies. But what defense could she offer against 10 years of evidence that Adrian Blackwood had no interest in her, no awareness of her devotion, no intention of ever offering her the life her parents now insisted she accept from someone else? The choice before her was brutally simple: surrender her impossible hope and accept security with Lord Pemberton, or maintain her vigil for a man who had never once looked at her with anything beyond polite indifference, and risk becoming the very burden her parents feared she would be. And sitting there in the morning room, with the scent of dying cherry blossoms drifting through the open window, Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, some fragile structure that had been holding her together through a decade of accumulated disappointment, and she heard herself say in a voice that sounded nothing like her own that she would receive Lord Pemberton when he called, that she would consider his suit with the seriousness it deserved, and her parents smiled with relief, while Eleanor looked past them to the garden beyond, and wondered if this was what surrender felt like. This quiet acquiescence to a future she had never wanted, but could no longer avoid. Lord Pemberton began calling on Thursday afternoons with the regularity of clockwork, arriving precisely at 3, with flowers or small volumes of poetry that he presented with a formal bow and a smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes, and Eleanor received him in the drawing-room where her mother sat at an appropriate distance, doing needlework and pretending not to monitor every word exchanged, while her father occasionally passed through to nod approvingly at Pemberton's presence, and the whole performance felt like a play in which Eleanor had been assigned a role she had no desire to perform, but could not refuse without consequences she was not prepared to face. Pemberton was exactly what her parents had promised, kind in a distant sort of way, appropriate in every gesture and comment, financially secure, with properties that he described in meticulous detail, as though acreage and annual yields might inspire romantic feeling, and utterly, completely, devastatingly devoid of anything that made Eleanor's heart quicken, or her breath catch, or her soul recognize itself in another human being. He spoke of weather and crops and the latest parliamentary debates with the same measured cadence, never saying anything that might challenge or surprise or reveal depths beneath his carefully maintained surface, and when he laughed it was a polite sound produced at socially appropriate moments rather than anything resembling genuine mirth. And Eleanor found herself counting the minutes until he would take his leave, and she could stop pretending that she found his company anything other than exhausting in its very pleasantness. They took walks in the garden where Pemberton commented on the cultivation of roses and the proper maintenance of gravel paths, while Eleanor tried to imagine this as her future, this endless procession of conversations about nothing that mattered. And they attended the theatre, where he explained the plot as though she could not follow it herself, and afterwards discussed the production's merits and flaws with the detached analysis of someone reviewing an agricultural report, and they took tea at her aunt's house, where Pemberton charmed the older ladies with his impeccable manners and appropriate deference, while Eleanor smiled until her face ached and wondered if this hollowness she felt was normal, if perhaps all women experienced this disconnect between what they were told they should want and what their hearts actually craved. She tried to appreciate his qualities the way one might try to appreciate a well-constructed piece of furniture. He was solid, reliable, built to last, designed to serve his purpose without flaw or deviation, but furniture did not inspire love, and when he took her hand to help her into the carriage or touched her elbow to guide her through a doorway, she felt nothing beyond the mild discomfort of contact with someone whose touch carried no electricity, no recognition, no promise of anything beyond social transaction. Her mother asked eagerly after each visit how the courtship progressed, and Eleanor provided the expected reassurances while carefully avoiding any admission of the emptiness that grew larger with each passing Thursday, and her father nodded with satisfaction and spoke of settlements and wedding dates as though these were already decided. Matters, and Eleanor felt herself being carried along by currents too strong to resist, a woman drowning in propriety and expectation, while everyone watching believed she was simply learning to swim. She knew she should feel grateful Pemberton was offering her security, status, and a future free from the fears her parents had articulated so clearly. But gratitude felt impossible when she sat across from him at tea and tried to imagine 40 or 50 years of this careful, courteous distance, tried to picture herself in his bed, bearing his children, growing old in his houses, and finding at the end of her life that she had traded the pain of unrequited love for the different but equally devastating pain of a heart that had never truly been engaged at all, and beneath all her polite smiles and appropriate responses, Eleanor felt something inside her screaming that this was wrong, that she was betraying herself in some fundamental way. But she had no alternative to offer, except a decade of evidence that the man she truly wanted had never wanted her in return. The Marchmont ball arrived on a Friday evening, when the air held that particular quality of early summer warmth, and Eleanor attended with Lord Pemberton at her side, his hand proprietorial at her elbow, as they entered the ballroom where chandeliers cast golden light across the assembled company, and she had dressed with more care than usual in a gown of deep emerald silk that her mother insisted brought out the color of her eyes, though Eleanor suspected the effort was less for Pemberton's benefit than for her own desperate need to feel something other than the numbness that had settled over her like fog in the 3 weeks since his courtship had begun, and when he asked for the second dance of the evening, she accepted with the practiced smile she had perfected, the one that suggested pleasure without promising anything her heart could not deliver, and they took their places in the set, while the musicians raised their instruments, and Eleanor prepared herself for another performance of contentment she did not feel. She moved through the figures with mechanical precision, her hand in Pemberton's as they turned and separated, and came together again, and he was speaking about something his sister's upcoming visit, or perhaps the condition of the roads between London and his Yorkshire estate. But Eleanor found herself unable to focus on his words because she had become suddenly acutely aware of a presence at the edge of the dance floor, a figure standing near the musicians with a glass of wine held loosely in one hand. And even before she turned her head to confirm what her body already knew, with the certainty of a decade's worth of practiced awareness, she felt the weight of Adrian Blackwood's gaze upon her like a physical touch. It was impossible, of course, because in 10 years he had never watched her, had never allowed his eyes to linger on her face or follow her movements across a room. He had maintained such careful distance that she had sometimes wondered if he even registered her presence at these gatherings, or if she had become simply part of the wallpaper of ballrooms, another unmarried woman, in a sea of faces that meant nothing to him. But when the dance brought her around to face the direction where he stood, Eleanor looked directly at him and found his eyes already fixed on her with an intensity that made her miss her step and stumble slightly, and Pemberton caught her arm with concern, while Adrian's expression shifted into something Eleanor could not name, something that looked almost like pain before he turned away and disappeared into the crowd near the card rooms. The rest of the dance passed in a blur of confusion and racing thoughts, Eleanor's mind trying to reconcile what she had seen with everything she knew to be true about Adrian's indifference, and she wondered if perhaps she had imagined it, if the weeks of Pemberton's courtship had finally driven her to invention, to seeing what she desperately wanted to see rather than what actually existed. But the image of Adrian's face remained branded behind her eyes, the tightness around his mouth, the way his fingers had whitened around the stem of his wineglass, the unmistakable focus of his attention that had been absent for so many years that its sudden presence felt like a violation of natural law. When the music ended, Pemberton escorted her to the refreshment table and went to procure lemonade, leaving Eleanor standing alone near a potted palm, and she found herself scanning the room with a desperation she knew was unwise, searching for Adrian among the clusters of guests, needing to know if she could catch that look again, if it had been real or merely a trick of candlelight and wishful thinking. And when she finally spotted him across the ballroom speaking with Lord Hertford and his wife, he was perfectly composed, perfectly indifferent, giving no indication whatsoever that moments ago he had been watching her dance with something that had looked remarkably like longing. And Eleanor pressed one hand against her stomach, where something had begun to flutter like a bird trapped against glass, a feeling she had thought long dead, now suddenly, inexplicably, painfully alive. A week later, Eleanor found herself at the Thornbury estate for a weekend party that her mother had insisted she attend with Pemberton as her acknowledged suitor, and by Saturday afternoon, the relentless cheerfulness of the gathering had become unbearable. The endless rounds of archery and lawn games, and musical performances in the drawing room, all demanding a level of enthusiasm, Eleanor could no longer manufacture, and so she slipped away during the interval between luncheon and tea, when most guests had retired to their rooms to rest. Making her way through corridors she half remembered from childhood visits, until she found the library tucked away in the east wing, where silence and the smell of old leather bindings promised sanctuary from the performance and contentment she had been maintaining since her arrival. The room was empty as she had hoped, its tall windows letting in the grey light of an overcast afternoon, and Eleanor moved along the shelves, trailing her fingers across spines embossed with gold lettering, seeking nothing in particular except the comfort of being alone with something real, something that did not require her to smile or nod or pretend that her heart was not in a state of confused upheaval since the Marchmont ball, when Adrian had looked at her with an expression she still could not decipher, and she had just pulled down a volume of Wordsworth's poems when she heard the door open behind her and turned to find Adrian Blackwood standing in the entrance, looking as startled to see her as she was to see him, his hand still on the door handle as though he might retreat at any moment, and for several seconds they simply stared at each other, while Eleanor's pulse accelerated in a way that made her feel foolish and transparent and impossibly young, despite her 28 years. He recovered first, entering the room and closing the door with a soft click that seemed to seal them into a space too small and too quiet for the charged silence that stretched between them, and Eleanor found she could not look away from his face, even as she felt heat rising in her cheeks. And finally, he spoke in a voice that was rougher than his usual polished tones, asking if she had come seeking refuge from the festivities as well, and she managed to nod and say something about needing a moment away from the noise, her own voice sounding strange and breathless to her own ears, and he moved further into the room, though he maintained a careful distance between them. As he said, he understood the impulse, that large gatherings could be exhausting even when they were supposed to be pleasurable, and Eleanor wondered if he felt the absurdity of this exchange as acutely as she did. This banal conversation about social fatigue, when they had barely spoken 10 words to each other in a decade, and now stood alone together in a quiet room, with her heart beating so hard, she was certain he must hear it. She asked without thinking if he came here often, immediately recognizing the ridiculousness of the question, and he smiled faintly and said he had always found the Thornbury Library to be well curated, particularly their collection of philosophy and natural history. And then there was another silence that felt different from the first, heavier somehow, as though the ordinary words they had exchanged were placeholders for something neither of them could say, and Eleanor clutched the Wordsworth volume against her chest like a shield, while Adrian stood near a reading table with his hands at his sides, looking at her with an expression she still could not interpret, in something between confusion and pain, and a longing that might have been merely a reflection of her own desperate hopes. And then he said abruptly that he should leave her to her reading, that he had not meant to intrude, and before Eleanor could respond or protest or ask him to stay, he had turned and walked back to the door, pausing only briefly with his hand on the handle to look back at her one more time with those unreadable dark eyes, before stepping through and pulling the door closed behind him, leaving Eleanor alone in the library, trembling from head to foot, with the Wordsworth still pressed against her ribs, and the certainty that something had just happened, though she could not name what it was, only that the air where he had stood seemed to still hold the shape of his presence, and her hands shook so badly when she tried to open the book that she had to set it down on the nearest table and press her palms flat against the wood to steady herself, and she stayed there for a long time, listening to her own ragged breathing and trying to understand why a brief, awkward conversation about nothing at all had left her feeling as though she had been turned inside out and exposed to a light too bright to bear. The weeks that followed the Thornbury Library encounter brought a shift in the very fabric of Eleanor's social existence, as though some invisible hand had rearranged the seating charts and guest lists and spatial configurations of every gathering to place her in Adrian Blackwood's orbit with a frequency that felt both deliberate and impossible, and she began to wonder if she was imagining the pattern or if something had indeed changed in the careful architecture of distance he had maintained for so long. Because at the Waverley dinner party, she found herself seated 3 chairs down from him at a table that seated 20, close enough that she could hear his voice when he spoke to Lady Waverley about agricultural reforms, and close enough that twice during the fish course she looked up to find his eyes on her before he quickly looked away, and then at the musicale hosted by the Duchess of Somerset, Eleanor had taken a seat near the back of the music room, only to have Adrian arrive late and take the only remaining chair, which happened to be directly beside hers, so close that when he sat down, the fabric of his coat brushed against her sleeve, and she could smell whatever soap or cologne he used, something clean and faintly cedar-scented that made her breath catch in her throat, and they sat through an entire performance of Schubert Lieder without speaking, while Eleanor's awareness of his presence beside her made it impossible to focus on the music, every small shift of his posture or clearing of his throat registering in her consciousness with disproportionate significance. And afterward, when the guests rose to take refreshment, he had turned to her and asked in a voice carefully stripped of inflection whether she had enjoyed the performance, and she had said yes, though she could not have recalled a single melody if her life had depended on it. At the card party at the Hendersons, Eleanor found herself at a whist table partnered with Adrian against Lord and Lady Fairmont, and for 2 hours they played cards with the kind of wordless coordination that suggested either great skill or great attunement to each other's thoughts. And when Adrian laid down the winning trick in the final hand, his fingers brushed against hers as they both reached for the cards at the same moment, and the contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but Eleanor felt it like an electric shock that travelled up her arm and lodged somewhere beneath her ribs, and she saw in his face a flicker of something that might have been the same shock of recognition before he withdrew his hand and stood to thank their opponents with perfect composure, while Eleanor remained seated trying to steady her, breathing and wondering how it was possible for a touch so brief to feel so monumental. The pattern continued through June as the season reached its height, with Adrian appearing at the Blackwoods garden party, where Eleanor was playing croquet with Pemberton and several others, Adrian standing on the sidelines watching the game with an expression she could not read, and then at the theatre where Eleanor sat in her family's box and looked across to see Adrian in the box opposite, his attention ostensibly on the stage, but his gaze sliding toward her during the intervals with that same quality of intensity she had first noticed at the Marchmont ball, and each encounter left Eleanor more confused and more certain simultaneously. Confused about what these moments meant, but certain that something was happening, some shift in the tectonic plates of their long stalemate. And yet through all of it, Adrian never asked her to dance, never sought her out for private conversation, never gave any indication beyond these accumulated moments of proximity and charged glances that he saw her as anything other than another acquaintance in their shared social circle, and Eleanor found herself caught in a kind of exquisite torture, hyper-aware of his presence whenever they occupied the same space, but unable to name what she was witnessing or whether it meant anything beyond her own desperate interpretation. And at night she lay awake, reviewing each encounter like a scholar, examining ancient texts for hidden meaning, searching for certainty in the angle of his gaze, or the tone of his voice, or the way his hand had trembled slightly when it touched hers over the whist cards. But certainty remained elusive, and Eleanor was left suspended between hope and madness, wondering if she was finally seeing what had always been there, or if she was constructing an elaborate fantasy from the raw materials of coincidence and wishful thinking. The announcement came during breakfast on a Tuesday morning in late June, when Eleanor sat across from her mother in the sunlit breakfast room, picking at toast she had no appetite for, while her father read the morning paper and made occasional commentary about parliamentary proceedings, and her mother set down her teacup with the kind of deliberate precision that always preceded statements of significance, and said that Lord Pemberton had spoken to Eleanor's father the previous evening and had indicated his intention to make a formal proposal within the fortnight. And Eleanor's mother's face was alight with satisfaction as she continued that this was everything they had hoped for. Pemberton was an excellent match with a fine estate and unimpeachable character, and Eleanor should consider herself fortunate that such a man had shown her such devoted attention, and Eleanor felt the walls of the breakfast room contract around her, as though the air itself had become thinner and harder to breathe, because a fortnight meant 2 weeks, meant 14 days, before she would have to give an answer to a question she had been avoiding looking at directly for months. And her mother was still speaking about wedding preparations and the necessity of ordering new gowns, and how they must begin compiling guest lists immediately, so that everything would be ready when the betrothal was announced, and Eleanor managed to nod and murmur something appropriate, while her mind spun with a dizzying mixture of panic and resignation, and that treacherous flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many times she told herself she was being foolish. The days that followed passed in a blur of social obligations that felt increasingly surreal, as though Eleanor were watching herself move through drawing rooms and gardens and ballrooms from a great distance, observing this woman in expensive dresses who smiled and conversed and accepted compliments about her upcoming happiness, while inside she felt like she was slowly drowning. And through it all, Adrian Blackwood continued to appear at the edges of her awareness, seated across from her at the Dalton dinner party, where their eyes met over the centerpiece of white roses and held for 3 heartbeats before he looked away, standing near the refreshment table at Lady Morrison's soirée, where Eleanor caught him watching her speak with Pemberton with an expression that looked almost like anguish, before his features smoothed into polite neutrality, and Eleanor began to feel as though she were losing her grip on reality, because how could she reconcile 10 years of studied indifference with these recent weeks of charged glances and orchestrated proximity? And late at night, when she could not sleep, she would lie in her bed staring at the ceiling and reviewing every encounter since the Marchmont ball, trying to determine whether she was witnessing something real or constructing an elaborate delusion from the desperate materials of her own longing. Because what if these moments she had been cataloguing and analyzing and investing with such significance were nothing more than coincidence and her own fevered imagination? What if Adrian had not changed his behavior at all, and she was simply seeing what she wanted to see, because the alternative was accepting a marriage to a kind man she did not love and relinquishing forever the dream she had carried for a decade? And the uncertainty was more painful than the original rejection had been, because at least the rejection had been clear and constant, whereas this ambiguity left her suspended between hope and despair, with no solid ground beneath her feet. Eleanor found herself analyzing her own thoughts with the detachment of a natural philosopher, examining a specimen, wondering if this was what madness felt like. This obsessive circling around the same questions without resolution. This inability to trust her own perceptions or distinguish between reality and wishful projection, and she thought perhaps she should speak to someone about what she was experiencing. But who could she tell? Because to voice her confusion would require admitting that she had spent 10 years harboring feelings for a man who had never shown her the slightest interest, and that now, when she was on the verge of accepting another man's proposal, she thought, perhaps, maybe possibly, the first man might feel something for her, after all, based on nothing more substantial than a few glances and accidental touches and moments of proximity that could be explained by the simple mathematics of a finite social circle. And spoken aloud it would sound absurd even to her own ears, the desperate rationalization of a woman who had wasted her youth on an unrequited attachment and now could not let it go even when happiness of a different sort was being offered to her. Her mother spoke daily about the proposal that was coming, reminding Eleanor how fortunate she was and how Lord Pemberton would make an excellent husband, and how Eleanor must not let this opportunity pass, and each reminder felt like another weight added to a scale, already tipping dangerously toward obligation and duty and the extinguishing of hope, and Eleanor began to steel herself for what she knew must come, the acceptance of Pemberton's suit and the final burial of the fantasy she had nurtured since she was 18 years old. Because surely it was time to be sensible, time to choose security over the painful uncertainty of these past weeks, time to become the woman her mother wanted her to be, rather than continuing to chase shadows and interpret glances, and imagine that Adrian Blackwood's carefully controlled expressions contained hidden messages meant only for her. The Ashford ball fell on the first Friday of July, when the heat of summer had settled over London like a weighted blanket, and the ballroom, despite its high ceilings and open windows, felt close and stifling, filled with the mingled scents of hothouse flowers and perfume, and the particular musk of too many bodies moving through complicated dance figures. And Eleanor stood near the edge of the room in a gown of pale blue silk that her mother had insisted would complement her complexion, watching Lord Pemberton dance with Lady Ashford's youngest daughter and feeling as though she watching her life from outside her own body, observing this woman who would soon accept a proposal from a good man and settle into the comfortable, predictable existence that awaited her, and the weight of it pressed down on her chest until she could not draw a full breath, and she murmured something to her mother about needing air, and slipped through the French doors onto the terrace before anyone could stop her or offer to accompany her, and the night air was scarcely cooler than the ballroom, but at least it was moving, carrying with it the scent of roses from the garden below and the distant sound of the orchestra playing a waltz she did not recognize. She descended the stone steps into the garden where lanterns hung from tree branches, casting pools of golden light across the gravel paths and the carefully manicured beds of summer flowers, and she walked deeper into the shadows away from the terrace where other guests had gathered to escape the heat, seeking the darker reaches of the garden where she might be alone with her thoughts for a few precious minutes before duty called her back, and she found herself near the fountain at the garden's center, where the water made soft musical sounds as it fell, and the moonlight turned everything silver and strange. And she stood there with her hands pressed against the cool stone rim of the fountain, thinking that in 2 days Pemberton would call and speak to her father, and the thing would be done, and the door on whatever foolish hope she had been, harboring, would close forever. She did not hear Adrian approach until he spoke her name from behind her, and she turned so quickly she nearly lost her balance. And there he was, standing in a shaft of moonlight, with his evening clothes perfectly arranged, and his expression unreadable in the shifting shadows. And he said, "Forgive me, I did not mean to startle you." But his voice held a quality she had never heard in it before, something raw and urgent that made her heart begin to race. And she said, "Lord Blackwood," because she could think of nothing else to say, and the formal address felt absurd given the circumstances. But what else was there between them, except formality and distance and all these years of careful avoidance? He took a step closer, and she saw that his hands were clenched at his sides, as though he were restraining himself from some action. And he said, "I saw you leave," and there was an admission in those 4 words that felt dangerous and thrilling and terrifying all at once. And Eleanor said, "I needed air," which was true but incomplete, and they stood there in the moonlight, beside the fountain, with the sounds of the ball drifting down from the house, and the night wrapped around them like a cocoon, separating them from the world they had just left. And Adrian said in a voice that seemed to be pulled from somewhere deep in his chest, "Why are you accepting Pemberton?" And the question hung between them, charged with everything they had never said to each other in 10 years of studied politeness and careful distance. Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked away and guarded for so long that its sudden exposure felt like violence, and she said, "That is hardly your concern." But her voice shook on the words betraying her, and Adrian took another step forward until they were close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw and the way his eyes looked almost black in the dim light. And he said, "Is it not?" And it was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but something in between. And Eleanor said, "You have shown no interest in my affairs for a decade, Lord Blackwood. I cannot imagine why you would begin now." And she heard the bitterness in her own voice and hated herself for it, but could not call it back. And Adrian flinched as though she had struck him and said, "You think I have shown no interest?" And his voice was rough and strange and filled with something that sounded like pain. And Eleanor said, "What else am I to think?" And they were closer now, though she could not say which of them had moved. Close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell that cedar scent she had noticed at the musicale, and see the rapid rise and fall of his chest as though he had been running, though he stood perfectly still. He opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes, saw him reach for words and fail to find them, or find them and decide against speaking them, and the silence stretched between them taut as a wire. And Eleanor thought wildly that she should return to the ballroom, that standing here alone with him in the dark garden was improper and dangerous, and she was promised to another man, or as good as promised. But her feet would not move and her eyes would not leave his face. And finally Adrian said, "Eleanor, just her name, nothing more," but he said it like a prayer or a curse or both. And then he turned and walked away from her back toward the lights of the house, leaving her standing alone beside the fountain, with her heart hammering against her ribs and her mind reeling, and the ghost of her name on his lips echoing in the darkness. Lord Pemberton called on the Sunday afternoon, following the Ashford ball, arriving precisely at 3 o'clock, as he had indicated he would in the note he had sent the previous day. And Eleanor sat in the drawing-room in a gown of rose-coloured muslin that her mother had selected, watching him settle into the chair across from her with the careful deliberation that characterized all his movements, and her parents had withdrawn with a show of discretion that fooled no one, leaving Eleanor alone with a man who had come to determine the course of her future. And Pemberton cleared his throat and began to speak about his estate and his prospects, and his deep regard for Eleanor's character and accomplishments, and she listened with a strange detachment, as though she were floating somewhere near the ceiling, observing this scene rather than living it, watching this kind, decent man offer her security and respect and a comfortable life. And when he finally asked the question that had been building through 10 minutes of preamble, when he said, "Miss Hartwell, would you do me the very great honor of consenting to become my wife?" Eleanor heard herself say, "Not yes, but might I have some time to consider?" And she saw the flicker of surprise cross his face, though he recovered quickly and said, of course she must take whatever time she required, though he hoped she would not keep him waiting over long. And after he left, her mother came into the drawing room with eyes bright with expectation, and Eleanor had to say that she had asked for time to think, and her mother's face fell into an expression of confused disappointment, and she said, "But why on earth would you need time, Eleanor? He is everything we could have hoped for." And Eleanor had no answer that would satisfy, because how could she explain that she needed time to kill whatever foolish hope still lived in her chest, time to reconcile herself to the death of a dream she had carried for 10 years, time to become the sensible woman who could accept a good man's proposal without reservation. The days that followed were a special kind of torture as Eleanor moved through her daily routines, while her mind circled endlessly around the same worn paths, reviewing every interaction with Adrian Blackwood from their first meeting a decade ago to that charged encounter in the Ashford garden, trying to construct a coherent narrative from fragments and glances and moments that might mean everything or nothing. And she would lie awake at night, cataloguing the evidence on both sides. The years of indifference weighed against these recent weeks of proximity. His question in the garden about why she was accepting Pemberton, set against his immediate retreat, when she challenged him, and no matter how many times she reviewed the data, she could reach no certain conclusion except that she was driving herself toward madness with this obsessive analysis. She thought about the library encounter, and the way he had looked at her across the Dalton dinner table, and that moment at the musicale when their hands had touched, and she tried to determine whether these instances represented a pattern of genuine feeling, or merely the inevitable friction that occurs when two people move through the same limited social sphere, and the uncertainty was corrosive, eating away at her ability to think clearly about anything else. And she began to understand that this was precisely why she needed to accept Pemberton's proposal, because she could not continue to live in this state of suspended animation, waiting for a sign that might never come from a man who had given her no reason to hope, except for a handful of ambiguous moments that could be explained by coincidence and her own desperate wishful thinking. Eleanor's mother grew increasingly anxious as the days passed without a decision, asking each morning whether Eleanor had reached a conclusion and reminding her that Lord Pemberton was a patient man. But his patience was not infinite, and other young women would be only too happy to accept what Eleanor seemed determined to refuse, and her father called her into his study one evening and spoke more gently than her mother, but with equal concern, saying that he wanted Eleanor's happiness above all things, but she must understand that opportunities like this did not come often, especially for a woman of 28, who had shown no interest in any of the other men who had paid her court over the years. And Eleanor sat in her father's study, feeling the walls close in, and knowing he was right, knowing that she was being foolish and romantic and utterly impractical, knowing that she should accept the security being offered rather than gambling everything on a fantasy. On the 7th day after Pemberton's proposal, Eleanor sat at her writing desk and composed a note asking him to call the following afternoon. And as she sealed the letter, she felt something inside her chest go cold and still, as though a door were closing on a room she would never enter again. And she told herself this was wisdom, this was maturity, this was what it meant to be a grown woman who understood that life required compromise and that love, as she had imagined it, was a fiction sold to young girls in novels, and she would accept Pemberton's proposal, and she would be grateful for his kindness, and she would build a life that was comfortable if not passionate, and in time she would forget that she had ever hoped for anything different. And this resolution should have brought relief, but instead it felt like grief, like mourning something that had never actually existed except in her own imagination. And she sat at her desk with the sealed letter in her hand and wept. Eleanor called on her sister Beatrice the following Tuesday afternoon, seeking distraction from her own thoughts and perhaps some of the uncomplicated warmth that had always existed between them, and Beatrice lived in a comfortable townhouse in Mayfair with her husband, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, who managed his family's shipping interests and had known Adrian Blackwood since their school days, though Eleanor had never thought to ask about this connection, until now when it suddenly seemed significant in ways she could not articulate. And she arrived at 2:30 to find Beatrice delighted to see her, and immediately ordering tea and settling Eleanor in the drawing room with promises that they would have a lovely afternoon together, and they spoke of inconsequential things for perhaps 20 minutes before the butler entered and announced that Lord Blackwood had arrived to see Mr. Whitmore on a matter of business, and Eleanor felt all the blood drain from her face as Beatrice said cheerfully that Thomas was in his study, and would Adrian mind waiting in the drawing room for just a moment while she fetched him. And then Adrian was standing in the doorway, looking as shocked to see Eleanor as she was to see him, and Beatrice performed the social niceties with the easy grace that came naturally to her, seemingly oblivious to the sudden tension that had filled the room like smoke, and she excused herself to find her husband leaving Eleanor and Adrian alone in a drawing room that suddenly felt very small, while outside the windows the sky had darkened with the promise of rain, and they stood there in the terrible silence that seemed to have become their natural mode of communication. And finally Eleanor said, "I did not know you had business with my brother-in-law," because she had to say something, and that seemed safer than anything else she might voice. And Adrian said, "It is a small matter regarding a shipment," and his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the strain beneath it. And he remained standing near the door as though he might bolt at any moment, while Eleanor sat rigidly in her chair with her hands folded in her lap and her heart beating so hard she thought surely he must hear it. The first drops of rain began to fall against the windows as they maintained their awkward positions, and Eleanor thought wildly that this was some kind of cosmic punishment, and to be trapped in a room with the one person she most needed to avoid, in the very week she had decided to close the door on whatever foolish hope she had been harboring. And she said, "The weather has turned," which was perhaps the most inane observation she had ever made. But Adrian nodded gravely, as though she had offered some profound insight, and he finally moved away from the door, coming to stand near the fireplace, where he picked up a small porcelain figurine and examined it with what seemed like desperate concentration. And the rain began to fall harder now, drumming against the glass in a rhythm that matched Eleanor's pulse. And she thought about the letter she had sent to Pemberton, asking him to call tomorrow, thought about the answer she had prepared to give, and she looked at Adrian's profile as he studied that ridiculous figurine, and felt something twist painfully in her chest. He set the figurine down and turned to face her, and for a moment their eyes met and held, and Eleanor saw something in his expression that she had never seen before, something raw and unguarded, and he said, "Miss Hartwell, I must apologize for my behavior at the Ashford ball. I had no right to question your decisions." And she said, "You had every right to ask." And then, because she was tired of careful words and diplomatic evasions, she said, "Though I confess I do not understand why you did." And she watched him struggle with this, watched the war play out across his features, and finally he said, "Because I cannot bear it." And the words seemed torn from him against his will, and Eleanor said, "Cannot bear what?" though she thought she knew, or hoped she knew, or feared she knew. And Adrian said, "The thought of you with him, with anyone." And then he stopped, as though he had said too much, and looked away from her toward the rain-streaked windows. And the silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before, charged with confession and possibility and terror. Eleanor rose from her chair and moved toward him without conscious decision, and she said, Adrian, using his given name for the first time in 10 years, and he looked at her with an expression of such longing and despair that she felt her breath catch, and he said, "I should not have said that I have no right." But Eleanor said, "Why do you have no right?" And her voice was shaking now, and they stood there in Beatrice's drawing room, with the rain falling outside and the afternoon light fading to grey. And Adrian said, "Because I have spent 10 years staying away from you, because I believed it was the right thing, the honourable thing, because I thought." And he stopped again as though the words were too difficult, and Eleanor said, "What did you think?" And she was close enough now to see the lines around his eyes, and the tension in his jaw, and the way his hands were clenched at his sides. And he said, "I thought you deserved better than what I could offer," and there was such pain in his voice that Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. And she said, "Better than what?" And Adrian said, "Better than a second, son with limited means and a family history best forgotten, better than a man who could give you nothing but his heart." And the confession hung between them as the rain continued to fall. The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious that might shatter if either of them moved too quickly, and Eleanor found she could not speak for a moment, and could not do anything but stare at Adrian as the rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, and the grey afternoon light cast shadows across his face. And she thought of 10 years of watching him from across ballrooms, 10 years of carefully composed indifference, 10 years of believing herself invisible to the one person she most wished would see her, and now he stood before her saying he had stayed away because he thought she deserved better. And the revelation was so unexpected and so utterly incomprehensible that she felt dizzy with it, felt the room tilt slightly, as though the very foundations of her understanding had shifted. She said, "Your heart," and her voice was barely a whisper, and Adrian looked away from her toward the rain-streaked windows as though he could not bear to meet her eyes. And he said, "I have watched you for 10 years, Miss Hartwell," and there was such rawness in his voice that Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. And he continued speaking in fragments, his words tumbling out in a way that was so unlike his usual careful control. And he said, "At every ball, every dinner, every musicale, I have watched you and told myself I was doing the right thing by staying away, that I was being honourable by not pursuing what I had no right to pursue." And Eleanor said, "What do you mean, no, right? What are you talking about?" Because none of this made sense, because if he had been watching her, then surely he must have known that she had been watching him too. And Adrian turned back to face her, and she saw that his composure was crumbling, saw the careful mask he had worn for a decade beginning to crack, and he said, I heard your father once speaking with Lord Ashford at his club. I was not meant to hear, but I did. And your father said that you deserved a man of substance and position, that you should not be wasted on some second son, with nothing to offer. And Eleanor felt ice flood through her veins as understanding began to dawn. And she said, "When was this?" And Adrian said, 10 years ago, just after we were introduced at your first ball." And the timeline clicked into place with horrible clarity, and Eleanor thought of that first meeting, thought of the way Adrian had seemed interested and then had simply vanished from her orbit, thought of 10 years of distance that she had attributed to indifference when it had been something else entirely. She wanted to be angry, but the emotion that rose in her was more complex than that, a terrible mixture of grief and frustration and a painful kind of hope, and she said, "So you decided for me," and Adrian flinched at the words, and he said, "I decided to give you the chance to find what you deserved. I could not trap you in a limited life when you could have so much more." And Eleanor said, "And what if what I deserved was the right to make my own choices?" And her voice was shaking now, and Adrian said nothing, but she could see the struggle in his face, and she pressed on because 10 years of silence had earned her the right to demand answers. And she said, "Did you never think to ask me what I wanted? Did you never consider that perhaps your assumptions about what I deserved might not align with my own desires?" And Adrian said, "I thought I was protecting you." And Eleanor said, "From what? From the possibility of happiness, from the chance to choose my own path." And the words came out harder than she intended, but she could not contain the tumult of emotions that his confession had and unleashed. The rain intensified outside, becoming a downpour that obscured the street beyond the windows, and Eleanor moved closer to Adrian until only a few feet separated them, and she could see that his hands were trembling slightly, though he kept them rigid at his sides. And she said, "You speak of watching me for 10 years, but did you ever truly see me? Did you see that I was watching you as well?" And Adrian's eyes widened slightly at this, and Eleanor felt a terrible vulnerability in admitting what she had never admitted to anyone, but she continued because the moment demanded honesty, no matter how exposing. And she said, "I have spent 10 years believing myself unworthy of your notice, 10 years thinking there was some fundamental flaw in me that made me invisible to you, and all this time." And her voice broke slightly, and she had to stop and gather herself before she could continue. And when she spoke again, her words were quieter but no less intense, and she said, "All this time you were staying away because you thought you were being noble." And Adrian said Eleanor, using her given name for the first time, and the sound of it in his voice was almost unbearable, and he said, "I am sorry, I did not know, I never imagined that you," and he could not seem to finish the sentence. And Eleanor said, "That I what?" And Adrian said, "That you might have wanted my attention, that you might have cared whether I noticed you." And the admission was so painfully honest that Eleanor felt tears threaten, and she said, "How could you not know?" And Adrian said, "Because I was so focused on staying away, on doing what I thought was right, that I blinded myself to everything else." And they stood there in the grey light with the rain falling and 10 years of misunderstanding between them, and Eleanor thought that this was both the worst and the best moment of her life. Worst because of all the time that had been lost, and best because finally, the truth was being spoken. The letter arrived 3 days after that rain-soaked afternoon in Beatrice's drawing room, delivered by a footman in plain livery, who waited only long enough to place it in Eleanor's hands before departing, and she recognized Adrian's handwriting immediately from the few times she had seen it on calling cards and dinner place settings over the years, and she took the letter to her room, with her heart racing and hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. And what she found inside was not what she had expected, not a declaration or a confession, but something more fragmented and painful, an apology that seemed to circle around its true meaning without ever quite landing on solid ground. And he wrote, "Miss Hartwell, I must beg your forgiveness for the impropriety of my words. During our recent conversation, I had no right to burden you with sentiments that can only cause confusion and distress." And Eleanor read this line 3 times, trying to understand whether he was apologizing for the confession itself or for the timing of it. And he continued, "I have spent these past days in considerable turmoil, reviewing choices made long ago, and wondering if the path I chose was truly the noble one or merely the cowardly one." And this admission struck her as almost more revealing than anything he had said in Beatrice's drawing room. And further down the page he wrote, I told myself for 10 years that staying away from you was an act of honor, that by keeping my distance, I was protecting you from a life of limitation and disappointment, but I begin to suspect that I was protecting only myself from the vulnerability of pursuing what I most desired and being found wanting. And Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at these words, felt the pain of them and the honesty, and she read on as Adrian's careful handwriting continued. I do not write this to seek absolution or to place any obligation upon you. I write only because the truth once begun must be finished, and the truth is that I have thought of you every day for 10 years, have carried the memory of our first meeting, like a talisman, have measured every choice against the question of whether it would make me worthy of you, even as I convinced myself that pursuing you would be selfish. And Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, with the letter in her hands, and tears beginning to blur her vision, and she read the final lines. You said I decided for you, and you were right. I presumed to know what was best, and in doing so, robbed us both of the chance to discover what might have been possible. I do not ask for your forgiveness, for I do not deserve it, but I wanted you to understand that my distance was never indifference, and my silence was never lack of feeling, and the letter was signed simply Adrian without title or formality, and Eleanor read it again immediately and then again, parsing each phrase for hidden meanings, and finding in the spaces between the words a decade of longing that matched her own, and she thought about the assumptions that had governed both their lives, thought about her father's careless words overheard in a club, and Adrian's decision to let those words determine the course of 2 lives, and she felt anger rising in her again, but also a terrible sadness for all the years that had been lost to misunderstanding and presumption. And she read the letter a 4th time, focusing on the phrase, I begin to suspect that I was protecting only myself, and recognized in it the painful self-awareness of someone confronting their own cowardice, and she thought about Pemberton's patient courtship and her mother's hopeful planning and the life she had been preparing to accept just days ago, and she thought about Adrian standing in the grey light of Beatrice's drawing room saying, I cannot bear the thought of you with him with anyone, and she knew with sudden crystalline clarity that she could not marry Pemberton, could not bind herself to safety and kindness when the possibility of something true, however difficult, however uncertain, now existed, and she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, where she would return to it dozens of times in the days that followed, reading and rereading until she knew every word by heart, trying to decode not just what Adrian had written, but what he had not written, trying to understand what he wanted from her, if anything, trying to determine whether this letter was a confession or a farewell, and she found no clear answer in the careful phrases and fragmented admissions, but she knew that something fundamental had shifted between them, and that whatever happened next, they could not return to the careful distance that had defined 10 years of their lives. Eleanor stood before the door of Adrian's townhouse on a grey Tuesday afternoon, when propriety demanded she should be anywhere else, her heart hammering against her ribs as she raised her hand to knock, and she thought of the letter folded in her reticule, thought of the 3 sleepless nights she had spent reading and rereading those carefully constructed sentences that circled around truth without ever quite landing on it, and she knew that seeking him out like this was scandalous, knew that arriving at a bachelor's residence without chaperone or prior arrangement could ruin her reputation beyond repair, but she found that she did not care anymore because 10 years of propriety and careful distance had brought her nothing but loneliness and the spectre of a marriage to a man she could never truly love, and when the butler opened the door, his face registered shock at finding a lady of quality standing unaccompanied on the steps, and Eleanor said, I must see Lord Blackwood immediately, with a firmness that surprised even herself, and the butler stammered something about his lordship not being at home to visitors, but Eleanor saw the flicker in his eyes that told her Adrian was indeed present, and she said, Please inform Lord Blackwood that Miss Hartwell is here, and that I will not leave until he receives me. And she stepped past the butler into the entrance hall before he could protest, and she heard voices from somewhere deeper in the house, and then footsteps approaching, and Adrian appeared at the top of the stairs, still in shirt-sleeves without his coat, and his face went pale when he saw her standing there, and he said, Eleanor, what are you doing here? You should not. And she cut him off, saying, I need answers, real answers, not fragments and apologies and carefully worded admissions that mean everything and nothing. And, Adrian descended the stairs, quickly telling the butler to leave them, and when they were alone in the hallway, he said, "You cannot be here if anyone should discover." And Eleanor said, "I do not care about discovery, I care about truth." And her voice was shaking, but she held her ground. And Adrian looked at her with an expression that contained equal parts anguish and longing, and he said, "Please let me call for a carriage, let me send you home before." And Eleanor said, "Before? What before we speak honestly for once? Before you tell me plainly what all these fragments mean?" And she pulled the letter from her reticule and held it up between them, and she said, "You write of staying away and of protection and of unworthiness, but you do not write of what you actually feel. You do not say clearly what any of this means." And Adrian reached for her arm as though to guide her toward the door, but stopped himself before touching her, and he said, "I have told you more than I should have told you, things that can only complicate your life when you have a perfectly good offer from Pemberton." And Eleanor felt fury rise in her at this, and she said, "Do not speak to me of Pemberton, do not deflect and dodge when I am asking you directly to tell me the truth." And Adrian said, "What truth do you want, Eleanor? What more can I possibly say?" And she moved closer to him until they stood only a foot apart in the dim hallway, and she said, "Tell me plainly, without equivocation, without noble excuses, what you feel when you look at me." And the question hung between them like something alive and dangerous, and Adrian's composure, which had been fracturing since the rainy afternoon, finally shattered completely. And he said, "I love you. I have loved you since the moment we met 10 years ago. I have loved you through every ball and dinner and musicale. I have loved you while watching you dance with other men, while listening to you laugh at their jokes, while knowing that I had no right to speak." And his voice broke on the final words, and Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, because this was what she had needed to hear, not apologies or explanations, but the simple, raw truth. And she said, "Then why did you stay away? Why did you waste 10 years? And Adrian said, "Because I thought it was what you deserved, because I convinced myself that loving you meant letting you find someone better." And Eleanor said, "You arrogant fool, you presumptuous, misguided man." And there was no heat in the words, only a kind of desperate sadness. And she said, "Did it never occur to you that I might have wanted a choice in the matter, that I might have preferred a modest life with someone I loved to a grand life with someone I did not?" And Adrian stared at her as though her words were incomprehensible, and he said, "You could not have wanted, you never showed any sign." And Eleanor laughed bitterly and said, "How could I show anything when you never looked at me, when you made it abundantly clear that I was beneath your notice?" And Adrian said, "Beneath my notice? You were never beneath my notice. You were so far above it that I could hardly breathe when you entered a room." And the admission seemed to cost him something, and Eleanor felt the last of her composure crumble, and she said, "Then why, Adrian, why all this distance, all this careful avoidance?" And he said, "Because I was afraid, because I knew that if I allowed myself to pursue you, I would be condemning you to less than you deserved. I could not bear to be the one who limited your life." And Eleanor closed the remaining distance between them and said, "You have already limited my life by your absence. You have given me 10 years of believing myself unworthy of love." And Adrian reached for her, then finally touching her face with trembling fingers, and he said, "You are worthy of everything. I am the one who is not worthy." And Eleanor said, "Let me decide, that let me have the choice you took from me 10 years ago." And they stood there in the hallway with the truth, and finally spoken between them, raw and painful, and somehow transformative. Adrian led Eleanor into his study, because they could not remain standing in the hallway where any servant might pass and see them in such intimate proximity, and once the door was closed behind them, he moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a long moment, as though gathering the courage to speak the whole truth. And when he finally turned, his face was marked with a kind of exhausted resignation, as though he had carried a weight for so long that the prospect of setting it down was both relief and terror. And he said, "I need to tell you how this began, how I made the choice that cost us 10 years. And Eleanor stood very still near the door, waiting for whatever revelation would come. And Adrian said, "It was at the Ashford ball the night we first met, and you were 18, and I was 24, and I had been in society long enough to be cynical about its rituals and calculations." And he paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of distress, and he continued, "Your father introduced us very briefly, just a polite acknowledgement, and you smiled at me, and I felt something shift in my chest, something I had never felt before. And Eleanor remembered that moment, remembered the flutter of hope she had felt at his handsome face, and the way his eyes had met hers for just an instant before he bowed and moved away. And Adrian said, "I watched you the rest of that evening, watched you dance and laugh with your friends, and I knew that I wanted to pursue your acquaintance, but I also knew the obstacles." And he moved away from the window, pacing. Now, as the words came faster, and he said, "I am a second son, Eleanor. My older brother inherited the estate and the title, and I have only a modest income from my mother's settlement and a position managing affairs for my brother." And Eleanor started to speak, but he held up a hand, asking her to let him finish. And he said, "Later that same evening I was in the card room, and your father was there with several other gentlemen, and they were discussing their daughters and their prospects as fathers do." And his voice took on a bitter edge, and he said, "Your father spoke of you with such pride, such obvious love, and he said that you deserved the very best, that he would never consent to see you married to anyone who could not provide you with security and position." And Adrian stopped pacing and looked directly at Eleanor, and he said, "He mentioned specifically that he had no patience for second sons with uncertain prospects that his daughter would marry well or not at all." And Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand the foundation of Adrian's decision, and he said, "I convinced myself that your father was right, that pursuing you would be selfish when I had so little to offer." And he laughed without humor, adding, "I told myself it was noble to stay away, that loving you meant wanting what was best for you, even if that meant you belonged to someone else." And Eleanor could hear the self-recrimination in his voice, and Adrian continued, "So I made a decision that night at that first ball. I decided I would not pursue you, would not call on you, would not allow myself to become attached when I knew that your father would never approve, and that I could never provide the kind of life you deserved." And he moved closer to her, his eyes searching her face, and he said, "But the decision to stay away did not diminish what I felt. It only made it more painful, and every time I saw you at a ball or dinner, I had to renew my resolve, had to remind myself why I could not approach you." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face now at the waste of it all, at the terrible logic that had governed both their lives. And Adrian said, "I watched you year after year, watched you dance with other men, watched you grow from 18 to 28, and I told myself I was doing the right thing, that by keeping my distance I was protecting you from limited life." And his voice broke slightly as he added, "I never imagined that you might have wanted something different, that you might have preferred modest comfort with someone you cared for to grand comfort with someone you did not." And Eleanor understood now the full scope of his mistake, understood how a single overheard conversation had shaped 10 years of loneliness for them both. And Adrian said, "When I saw you with Pemberton, something in me finally broke. I could not maintain the pretense anymore, could not continue to tell myself that my distance was noble when it felt like dying." And he reached for her, hands tentatively as though afraid she might pull away, and he said, "I am so sorry, Eleanor, for all the years I stole from us, for all the assumptions I made without ever asking what you wanted." And Eleanor gripped his hands tightly, feeling the truth of his confession settle over her, like something heavy and transformative. Eleanor felt something break loose inside her chest as she listened to Adrian's apology, and the emotion that surged through her was not the relief or joy she might have expected, but instead a white-hot fury that made her pull her hands from his and step back, and she said, "You are sorry," with a voice that shook with barely contained rage, and Adrian looked startled by the sudden shift in her demeanor, and she continued, "You are sorry for stealing 10 years from us, for making decisions about my life without consulting me, for presuming to know what I wanted better than I knew myself." And her voice rose as the full weight of what had been lost crashed over her, and she said, "You heard one conversation, one single evening of my father expressing his hopes for my future, and from that you constructed an entire edifice of noble sacrifice without ever considering that I might have different desires, different dreams, different values than what you assumed." And Adrian said, "Eleanor, please, I thought I was protecting you." But she cut him off, saying, "You were protecting yourself from the possibility of rejection, from having to risk actually asking me what I wanted, from having to trust that I might choose you, despite your modest circumstances." And the truth of her own words struck her even as she spoke them, and she saw Adrian flinch as though she had struck him physically. And she said, "Do you know what these 10 years have been like for me? Do you have any comprehension of what it means to love someone who will not even look at you, who treats you as though you are invisible?" And tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady and sharp, and she continued, "I convinced myself that there was something wrong with me, that I was unworthy of your notice, that my feelings were pathetic and foolish, because why else would you be so determined to avoid me?" And Adrian said, "I never meant for you to feel that way, I never imagined." And Eleanor said, "No, you did not imagine. You did not ask, you simply decided what was best and acted accordingly." And she paced away from him toward the window, where he had stood moments before, and she looked out at the grey afternoon and said, "I could have married years ago, there were other offers. Not as grand as Pemberton, perhaps, but respectable men who might have made me content." And she turned back to face him, adding, "But I did not accept them because some foolish part of me kept hoping that you would see me, would speak to me, would give me any sign that I was not alone in what I felt." And Adrian's face was pale and stricken, and he said, "I did see you, Eleanor, I saw you constantly. I memorized every dress you wore, every dance you shared with other men, every smile you gave to people who were not me." And Eleanor said, "Then why did you not speak? Why? Did you let me suffer in silence?" And Adrian said, "Because I thought silence was kinder than offering you a life of limitation." And Eleanor moved close to him again and said, "You arrogant, presumptuous man," and this time there was both anger and something else in her voice, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. And she said, "I never wanted grand estates or titles or wealth. I wanted someone who saw me truly, who valued my mind and my heart, who made me feel alive." And her voice dropped to barely more than a whisper as she added, "I wanted you, Adrian. I have wanted you since that first night, when you bowed and walked away, and I have wanted you through every lonely year since." And she saw his eyes fill with tears, and she said, "But you never gave me the choice you decided for both of us, that we would be better apart, that your love required distance rather than presence." And Adrian reached for her again, and this time she let him take her hands, and he said, "I was wrong, Eleanor, I was so terribly wrong, and I do not know how to repair what I have broken." And Eleanor looked at their joined hands and felt the anger begin to transform into something else. And she said, "I do not know either. I do not know if 10 years can be forgiven or forgotten." And Adrian said, "I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking only for a chance to try to build something now with the time we have left." And Eleanor felt exhausted suddenly, as though the fury had burned through her, leaving only a profound weariness. And she said, "I need time to think. I need to understand what this means." And Adrian nodded and said, "I will give you all the time you need." And they stood there in his study with the truth finally spoken between them, raw and painful, and somehow necessary. 3 weeks passed before Eleanor received the invitation to the Winterbourne ball, and when she saw the familiar crest on the cream-colored card, she felt her hands begin to tremble, because this was the same venue where she and Adrian had first met a decade ago, the same ballroom where he had bowed politely and walked away, planting the seed of a longing that would define 10 years of her life. And she had already refused Lord Pemberton's suit in a conversation that left her mother in tears and her father grimly silent, and she had spent the weeks since her confrontation with Adrian in a state of suspended uncertainty, because they had not spoken again after she left his study, though she had received one brief note saying only, "I will wait for your answer for as long as it takes." And now she stood in her dressing room while her maid fastened the buttons of her gown, which was a deep midnight blue that made her skin look luminous in the candlelight, and she thought about not attending, thought about sending her regrets and staying home in the safety of her room. But something in her insisted that she must go, that whatever was to happen between her and Adrian must be faced rather than avoided. And so she descended the stairs and climbed into the carriage and made the familiar journey to the Winterbourne estate, where the windows blazed with light and music, spilled out into the winter evening. And when she entered the ballroom, it was as though she had stepped backward in time to that night 10 years ago, when she had been 18 and full of hope. And the same chandeliers cast the same golden glow, and the same musicians played in the gallery, and the same crush of elegant bodies moved in patterns of dance and conversation. And Eleanor stood at the edge of the room, scanning the crowd with her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. And then she saw him standing near the windows in conversation with another gentleman. But his attention was not on his companion, because his eyes were moving across the ballroom, searching and when his gaze found her, she saw him go very still, and he excused himself from his conversation and began to move toward her with a deliberate, purposeful stride that made the crowd seem to part before him, and Eleanor could not move, could not breathe, could only watch as he crossed the distance between them, with his eyes never leaving her face, and when he reached her, he bowed with the same formal courtesy he had shown 10 years ago, but this time he did not walk away, and instead he said, "Miss Hartwell, would you grant me the honor of this dance?" And his voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his eyes, and she said yes, because what else could she say when this was the moment she had imagined for a decade? And he took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, and as the music began, they moved together in the steps of a waltz that felt both achingly familiar and entirely new, and he held her with perfect propriety, but she could feel the warmth of his hand through her glove, could feel the solid presence of him after years of distance, and they danced in silence for several measures, while around them the other couples swirled, and the chandeliers threw patterns of light across the polished floor, and then Adrian leaned closer, his mouth near her ear, and said in a voice meant only for her, "I have loved you since we met, Eleanor, from that first moment, 10 years ago. In this very room I have loved you, and I have been a fool and a coward, and I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for a chance to prove that I can be worthy of what you have already given me." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she said, "You whispered that you loved me, but you never showed me, never gave me any sign." And Adrian said, "I am showing you now in front of everyone here. I am claiming what I should have claimed a decade ago." And she looked up at him and saw in his face such naked hope and fear that her anger finally began to dissolve into something that might eventually become forgiveness. And she said, "This is only a beginning, Adrian. We have much to repair." And he said, "I know, and I will spend whatever time it takes." And they continued to dance as the ballroom spun around them, and Eleanor felt for the first time in 10 years that she was precisely where she was meant to be. The morning after the Winterbourne ball, Eleanor woke to find a note delivered with her breakfast tray, and the handwriting was Adrian's careful script, asking if he might call upon her that afternoon, and when he arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, her mother received him with a coolness that bordered on hostility, because Eleanor had confessed her refusal of Pemberton and her feelings for Adrian, and her mother could not understand why her daughter would choose a second son with modest means over a wealthy lord. But Eleanor sat in the drawing room with Adrian, while her mother served as reluctant chaperone, and they spoke of small things at first, the weather and the previous evening's festivities, but there was an ease between them, now that had been absent, before a sense that the worst had been revealed and survived, and when Adrian left, he asked if he might call again the next day, and Eleanor said yes, and so began a pattern that would define the following weeks. He came each afternoon, sometimes bringing books he thought she might enjoy or flowers from his modest garden, and they took chaperoned walks through the park where the early spring flowers were beginning to emerge from winter's grip, and they discovered in each other a compatibility that went beyond the attraction that had sustained Eleanor through 10 years of longing, for they shared views on literature and philosophy and politics, and Adrian made her laugh with observations that were both clever and kind, and Eleanor found that she could speak her mind freely without fear of censure or dismissal, and he listened to her opinions with genuine interest, treating her thoughts as worthy of consideration rather than merely indulging feminine whimsy. Her father remained skeptical, calling Adrian to his study one afternoon for what Eleanor could only imagine was an interrogation about his prospects and intentions, and when Adrian emerged an hour later, he looked somewhat pale but determined, and he told Eleanor later that her father had made clear his disappointment that she had refused a more advantageous match, but Adrian had stated his intentions plainly and promised to provide for Eleanor to the best of his ability, and her father had grudgingly given permission for the courtship to continue, though he had not given his blessing. As the weeks accumulated into a month and then 2, Eleanor watched her mother's resistance gradually soften, for it was impossible to witness Eleanor's transformation and not recognize that this was something more than girlish infatuation, and Eleanor, who had moved through the world with a quiet sadness for so long now, seemed to radiate light, and she smiled more easily and spoke more freely, and there was a vitality in her that had been dormant, and even Eleanor's mother, who valued social advantage above most things, could not deny that her daughter was happier than she had ever been. One evening in May, as the gardens burst with bloom, Adrian asked Eleanor to walk with him in her family's modest grounds, and her mother permitted it with only her younger sister as distant chaperone, and they moved along the gravel paths while the sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Adrian stopped beneath an old oak tree and took both of Eleanor's hands in his, and he said, "I know that I have already told you I love you, but I have not asked you properly if you might consent to be my wife." And Eleanor felt her breath catch because, even though she had known this moment was coming, it still struck her as almost miraculous that after 10 years of silence they had arrived here. And Adrian continued, "I cannot offer you grand estates or titles, or the kind of luxury that Pemberton could have provided, but I can offer you my whole heart and my complete devotion, and a life built on truth and partnership." And Eleanor said, "Yes, Adrian, yes, of course, yes," because there was no other answer she could give to the only question that had ever mattered, and he slipped a ring onto her finger, a simple band with a small sapphire that had belonged to his grandmother, and they stood together in the fading light while her sister discreetly turned away, and Adrian kissed her for the first time, a gentle meeting of lips that carried the weight of 10 years of longing, finally realized. And Eleanor thought that no moment in her life had ever felt more perfectly right. The preparations for the wedding were modest, for Adrian's circumstances did not permit extravagance, but Eleanor cared nothing for elaborate displays, and she worked with quiet joy to plan a ceremony that would be simple and meaningful, and her mother gradually embraced the inevitable, even helping to select Eleanor's gown and plan the wedding breakfast, and her father walked her down the aisle of the small church, with an expression that suggested he still had reservations but had accepted his daughter's choice. And when Eleanor saw Adrian waiting at the altar, his face radiant with love and certainty, she felt the last remnants of those 10 painful years finally release their hold on her heart, and they spoke their vows before God and witnesses, and they became husband and wife, and Eleanor knew that while they could not recover the time that had been lost, they could build something true and lasting with the years they had been given. 5 years had passed since Eleanor and Adrian spoke their vows in that small church, and now they stood together in the garden of their modest home, watching their 2 children chase each other through the flower beds, while the afternoon sun cast everything in shades of amber and gold, and Adrian's arm was around Eleanor's waist with a casual intimacy that still sometimes made her heart catch, because even now she remembered the years when such closeness seemed impossible, and their daughter Catherine, who was 3 years old, stumbled on the uneven ground, and her brother Thomas, who was nearly 5, caught her hand and helped her up with a gentleness that reminded Eleanor so much of Adrian that she felt tears prick her eyes, and Adrian must have noticed because he pulled her closer and said, "What is it, my love?" And she shook her head and said, "Only happiness, nothing more." Which was true because these 5 years had been filled with a contentment so complete that sometimes she could hardly believe it was her life she was living. Their home was not grand, a comfortable manor house with enough rooms for their growing family and gardens that Eleanor tended herself with help from a modest staff. And Adrian's work kept them secure if not wealthy, and Eleanor had discovered that she cared nothing for the ballrooms and social competitions that had once defined her world, because she had something infinitely more valuable in the quiet evenings when she and Adrian sat by the fire, reading aloud to each other, or discussing the events of the day, or simply existing in companionable silence, and in the mornings when he kissed her goodbye before leaving for his work, and in the nights when they lay together in the darkness, speaking of dreams and memories and the future they were building together. Sometimes Eleanor thought about those 10 lost years and felt a pang of regret for the time they could have had. But mostly, she had made peace with the past because she understood now that perhaps they had both needed those years to become the people who could build this life together, and Adrian had learned that love sometimes required risk and vulnerability rather than noble sacrifice. And Eleanor had learned that her own worth was not determined by others' recognition, but by her own truth and courage. Dear listener, if you have stayed with us through this story, then perhaps you understand what Eleanor and Adrian discovered in their years of separation and their ultimate coming together, that assumptions made in silence can steal decades of joy, and that the courage to speak truth even when it feels impossible can redeem what seemed irretrievably lost, and that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for those we love is not to decide for them what they need, but to offer them the honest choice and trust them to know their own hearts. Consider how often we make decisions based on what we believe others want or need or deserve, How often we silence our own truth because we have convinced ourselves that our silence is somehow noble or protective, and how many years we lose to fears that are never spoken aloud and therefore never challenged or resolved. And understand that while Eleanor and Adrian found their way back to each other, not every story ends with such grace, and the years lost to misunderstanding and presumption cannot always be recovered. If there is someone in your life whose regard you crave, if there is a truth you have been holding in silence because you fear the consequences of speaking, if there are years accumulating while you wait for the perfect moment or the certain outcome, then let this story be a gentle encouragement to choose courage over caution, honesty over assumption, and the risk of rejection over the certainty of regret. For Eleanor spent 10 years believing herself unseen when she was seen and loved all along, and those years cannot be reclaimed no matter how happy the ending. May you find the strength to speak the truths that matter. May you trust that those who truly love you can handle your honesty even when it is difficult, and may you build your life on foundation of authentic connection rather than careful distance. And may you rest tonight knowing that it is never too late to begin again, that hearts can heal even from years of misunderstanding, and that love, when finally acknowledged and claimed, can illuminate all the dark places we thought would remain in shadow forever. This has been a story from Love and Deep Space, where we believe in the transformative power of truth and the redemptive possibility of love. And if this tale has touched your heart, then we invite you to subscribe and join us for more stories of courage and connection and the journeys we take toward the lives we are meant to live. And until we meet again, may you walk in honesty and rest in peace, and know that you are worthy of being seen and loved exactly as you are.